Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. We typically identify three presidents of the progressive era, three progressive presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Today we're going to focus on the first two, TR and Taft. They're both pretty fascinating presidents with some pretty excellent stories. So, dear students, incline your ears and hear our stories so that you might find your place among his delights. We have four objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 14, describe Theodore Roosevelt's background and his rise to power. 15, outline Roosevelt's role in regulating business, protecting public health and the environment, as well as the promotion of civil rights through federal power. Number 16, you should be able to summarize the events of the Taft presidency. And 17, explain the divisions in the Republican Party and their impact on the election of 1912. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 14. And here I want to introduce young Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was born into a prominent New York family in 1858. His father was a businessman and a philanthropist and a man of some means. He helped found some hospitals and museums and charities. Roosevelt's youth was largely shaped by his poor health. Historians always describe him as a sickly boy, but it's not super clear what it was that was afflicting him. He probably had asthma and maybe debilitating asthma. He repeatedly experienced sudden nighttime asthma attacks and caused the experience, it felt like he was being smothered to death. It terrified young Theodore. It terrified his parents. Doctors of the era had no cure and very few treatments, and really no effective ones. Still, though, Roosevelt was an energetic boy, and he trained constantly to build up his strength and his endurance. He went on long, strenuous hikes and tough exercises. After being manhandled by two older boys on a camping trip, he even went as far as founding a boxing coach to teach him how to fight and to get strong and to strengthen his body. He later went on to study jiu-jitsu, a type of martial arts where a person trains for unarmed combat to kill or subdue one's opponents with their bare hands. Jiu-jitsu would have been pretty unique as a young man of this era, but I think it's pretty characteristic of Teddy Roosevelt that he was just going to make himself the best possible physical and mental specimen that he could get. He was also an inquisitive kid. Theodore Roosevelt was essentially homeschooled. We didn't have that term back then, but he was essentially a homeschooled kid with a lifelong hobby as a naturalist. In particular, he had some interest in zoology and field biology. As a boy, he even learned some, taxidermy to preserve and stuff the animals he went on hunting for exhibition. And in 1876, he was admitted to Harvard College, where he went to go advance his studies. Subpoint B. Let's talk about adult Theodore here, adult Teddy, and he had a lot of different interests. This was a guy that his curiosity couldn't be contained. His 1882 book, The Naval War of 1812, established his reputation as a learned historian and as a popular writer. It's very hard sometimes to find those two things together, the academic credentials of a historian and somebody that somebody wants to read. But he also spent time, not just on books, but he worked as a working cowboy in a cattle ranch in North and South Dakota. Teddy Roosevelt went on to have a career in the military. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President William McKinley, but he actually resigned that position to go lead the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War and returned afterwards as a war hero. That's when he entered politics, and he entered politics as the leader of the reform faction of the Republicans in New York State Legislature. So he's a Republican, and he's calling for all kinds of new progressive era reforms. In 1898, he was elected as governor of the state of New York. William McKinley's vice president, Garrett Hobart, died in 1899, and the New York State Party leadership convinced McKinley to accept Roosevelt as his running mate in the 1900 election. This was partly because Roosevelt was a independent-minded governor who the New York political bosses just couldn't control, and they figure, well, how do we get rid of this guy? There's no better position than appointing him to vice president, because the vice president doesn't really have many duties from day to day, so that's a way we can get this problematic person out of our hair and out of our way. Roosevelt threw himself into the job. He campaigned vigorously, and the McKinley-Roosevelt ticket won in a landslide victory based on their platform of peace and prosperity and conservation, and with the help of running against William Jennings Bryan. So when President McKinley, though, was shot by an anarchist at Subpoint C. He was shot by an anarchist rebel and Kind of a fascinating side plot that we're not going to really get into, but it's definitely worth a Wikipedia read. Roosevelt became president at the age of 42. He became the youngest person to assume the presidency. Now, sometimes we think it was John Kennedy who was the youngest person president, but Kennedy was the youngest to be elected president. Young Teddy Roosevelt was thrust into the job at 42. His leadership and publicity campaigns helped create that modern presidency. And I think this is why we really remember Roosevelt so well. He reinvented the role of the president to more or less kind of how we expect the president to operate today. He supported the federal government's role when the states didn't solve their problems. He said essentially, states, it's the progressive era, let's all be reformers. But states, if you're not reforming, if you're not solving your problems, then the federal government will step it in and do it for you. He began to take this activist approach in policymaking, and he started calling it his square deal, square meaning fair. So give people a square deal. And the term became synonymous with progressive reforms. Theodore Roosevelt was a master of the bully pulpit, a term he coined. He would use bully to basically describe anything he'd like. He'd say, boy, that's a bully piece of steak, and it meant that was a really good piece of steak. Here he was using the bully pulpit, saying that the president has a powerful voice. And when the president wants to get behind an issue, he can make the news headlines however he wants to go champion for his cause. And so he can use this bully pulpit as a powerful voice by which to advocate his agenda. Because presidents can so easily dominate the news cycles, he figured that he was in a strong position to influence public opinion. Roman numeral number 15. The thing that we probably associate most with Teddy Roosevelt is his economic reforms that we refer to as trust busting. By the 1900s, trusts, a business arrangement that we learned about in our previous unit, the trust controlled about 4 out of 5 of major American industries. So about 80% of major industries were controlled through this legal structure known as a trust. And Roosevelt believed that trusts weren't inherently bad, but gone awry, they definitely did threaten the public interests, particularly ones like Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which was using unfair business practices against its competitors and then unfair business practices towards its customers. The Sherman Antitrust Act was designed to go break up trust. I mean, it's called the Antitrust Act, but it was largely ineffective. It was a toothless law that had a hard time going and achieving its goals. Teddy Roosevelt used the act as best he could. His first major victory came over the Northern Securities Company, a monopoly on railroad business in the Northeast. The Supreme Court successfully dissolved that company, and it sent a shock through the markets. The financial markets were rocked by the thought that the presidency and the Supreme Court were going and attacking big businesses. That looked like a bad investment deal. But it earned Teddy Roosevelt the reputation as the trust buster and as a defender of the people. While it might have been in the short term kind of rocky on financial markets, it was in the long term the thing that Teddy Roosevelt would be known for. Although he successfully broke up 44 successful trusts, honestly, in the big picture, 44 wasn't that many, and he was really unable to slow the merger process, the merger movement through business. Subpoint B. And when 140,000 Pennsylvania coal miners went on strike in 1902, they went on strike to achieve a 9-hour workday. Coal mining is particularly strenuous, it's dangerous, it's exhausting. While other industries might be able to go on a 10-hour workday, coal mining, they really felt were hitting their limit. They also said that they were dramatically underpaid, and these Pennsylvania coal miners wanted a 20% pay raise. And when they charged those, when they made those claims, the mine operators, their bosses, refused to negotiate, and so they went on strike, on a 5-month strike. And over the course of that 5 months, the coal reserves in America were getting pretty low. Coal not only was affected business, but just like households used coal. And when the miners, specifically were striking in Pennsylvania, but the strike was carrying on, and it was a pretty disruptive piece to the supply chains. So Teddy Roosevelt said, okay, we can't have this. America needs its fuel. So he called miners and mine operators together to a meeting at the White House, and there he settled the strike. He called both sides to the arbitration table, saying both sides need to come together and actually meet on this thing. And when he did so, he set a new principle of federal intervention when a strike threatens the public interest. Basically saying that, like, this strike is no longer about your wages and it's no longer about how you're operating the mines. It's about affecting Americans. And when that happens, the president has a responsibility to step in. Subpoint C. though the Interstate Commerce Act prevented railroads from colluding on prices. You might remember from our discussion on the populace that railroads would sometimes get together and arrange their prices together, so there wasn't really competition in the marketplace. The Interstate Commerce Commission was designed to go stop that, to prevent them colluding on prices. In reality, it, like the Sherman Antitrust Act, had kind of a hard time enforcing that law. It was a toothless act. So Roosevelt pushed for federal legislation to go control those abuses. He passed the Elkins Act. The Elkins Act was designed to go stop rebates and sudden rate changes that ended up causing people different, price changes, and you never knew how you were going to get your stuff to the market. Roosevelt also signed a law known as the Hepburn Act. The Hepburn Act limited free railroad passes. This was a pretty common way that railroads would go get around laws or have sweetheart deals made for their deals. They could basically give a kickback to a politician without ever having to make it money. Politicians that have a hard time accepting cash because it just looks so corrupt, but railroad tickets seemed like it was a fairer deal, and railroads used them to their advantage. The Hepburn Act limited the railroad passes, saying you just can't buy off your congressman with stuff instead of money. Also, the Interstate Commerce Commission started setting maximum rates for travel in order to keep prices down for the consumers. Subpoint D. Here I want to introduce a new person named Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair was an author. We consider him largely a muckraker for his investigative journalism, but the thing that we really remember him for was a novel that he wrote. I've read it. It's called The Jungle. It's not all that good of a novel. Okay, so there's a lot of times that books become important without being good. The Jungle is a classic example of it. So it describes the unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry. So how people are buying their food. And The Jungle basically describes, it's supposed to be about describing the awful treatment that the workers go through, but the part that everybody remembered is how disgusting the plant was and how the food they're trying to buy is just filthy, gnarly stuff. Upton Sinclair wanted to inspire a socialist revolt. He was a socialist and wanted to inspire future socialism. But what the actual result was that people just got grossed out about their food production and they demanded change. Roosevelt commissioned a commission to go investigate. And there, the investigation found real evidence of Sinclair's claims on the industry. So Teddy Roosevelt pushed for the 1906 Meat Inspection Act, dictating sanitary food preparation requirements, and created the Federal Meat Inspection Program. He also is the brains behind the Food and Drug the Food and Drug Act. There were advertisements that were claiming, the medicines were these unbelievable claims that were just outright impossible to prove or just patent lies. Plus, the medicines were often really unsafe. They often contained unregulated amounts of opium and alcohol and cocaine, and it's like, I don't know if we're going to call all these things medicine, guys. The Pure Food and Drug Act, pushed forward by the Roosevelt administration, halted the sale of contaminated food and medicine, and it required truth in labeling. If somebody picks up a bottle and reads its ingredients, that those ingredients are real. Subpoint E. In the late 19th century, industry was ravaging the countryside, and this spoke very deeply to Teddy Roosevelt's naturalist heart. As a conservationist, a person that loved wild spaces, and so he established in 1877, well, he didn't establish, the Forest Service had been established in 1877, and they were managing 45 million acres of land. But the U.S. Forest Bureau did allow the cutting of forests, and it took no efforts to replant the land. The U.S. Forest Bureau today still operates allowing logging and allowing trees to be cut down. It's not, the Forest Bureau is not the national parks, but their job is to manage responsible logging so that the forests are always in a healthy position. But in these early days of the Forest Bureau, they weren't really interested in replanting the land. Then you also had miners. Mining it's still a pretty kind of polluting process, but it was particularly bad then, littering the land and polluting the waters without any regard for the impact they were having on the earth. Ranchers were overgrazing the plains, and farmers were, clear-cutting fragile forest land for their new farmland. And Teddy Roosevelt said, this just can't continue, and started setting aside forest reserves, sanctuaries, and national parks, believing that conservation was part preservation, part of these to be unspoiled, but also part development for the public, saying that people should go and experience the parks. It's a park. You should be able to go to it. This middle path between private development interests and wild conservation efforts like, those of John Muir, a fascinating guy you should go look about. This was kind of a middle path that Roosevelt was taking, saying it's part conservation, but also part usage. Subpoint F. As far forward as Roosevelt was thinking on, so many areas, he was still a man of his time and wasn't all that supportive of wide-ranging civil rights for African Americans. Nevertheless, he did take some overtures towards black people, and I don't think Teddy Roosevelt gets enough credit for this, although we do have to remember that he's not a progressive on rights issues, although he might have been more than many of his peers. He did make some overtures. He named some African Americans to the civil service positions. He basically was able to desegregate the government, so allowing black people to go get government jobs. And he went as far as inviting Booker T. Washington to the White House. This was pretty classic Booker T. Washington, as that himself somewhat of an accommodationist. Got a lot of doors open. He gets himself invited to the White House for a conference. It was during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency that the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was founded in 1909 by the, Washington's somewhat rival, W.E.B. Du Bois. And there was the goal of full equality among races. I don't think we could really give Roosevelt the credit for that, but it fits in his timeline. Roman numeral number 16? Yeah, Roman numeral number 16. When Roosevelt won election himself in 1904, remember he assumed the presidency coming up as inheriting the job after the death of McKinley, and then he ran for election in 1904 and won there. Roosevelt promised in 1904 that in 1908 he wasn't going to run again. He would step down from the White House. And so he did, and instead handpicked his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, to go run against, surprise, William Jennings Bryan. And so, Roosevelt doesn't get to, name his successor, but he has a lot of power in the Republican Party and says, this is the man that the Republicans should nominate, and they follow his suit. So, with Roosevelt's support, Taft won the nomination and easily won office. Taft was not Roosevelt, though. We consider him a progressive reformer, but he, the vice president was, or the follower was not the man, and he had a lot less bravado than Roosevelt. Roosevelt was an extrovert. He loved being the center of attention. He had a big toothy grin and loved that everybody swarmed around him. Taft wasn't really like that. He was a more introverted, kind of a policy man, not a showman. And he only cautiously pursued the progressive era. Because he wasn't nearly as ostentatious as Teddy Roosevelt, Taft got very little credit for his successes. He didn't use the presidential bully pulpit to arouse public opinion the same way that Roosevelt did. Still, though, he had some important pieces. He campaigned on lowering tariffs, a pretty typical progressive position on taxes. The House of Representatives, though, passed the Payne Bill, the P-A-Y-N-E, the Payne Bill, which would lower tariffs. And the Senate passed the Aldrich Bill, which would also lower some tariffs, although it wasn't as wide-sweeping as the Payne Bill was. And when those two bills were put together, the Payne-Aldrich Bill, the compromise was that, tariffs were lowered on some areas and then changed on others, and the result actually went the other way around, and it moderately raised tariffs overall. Taft said, this isn't a perfect bill, but it's a good compromise, and he signed it. But the compromise caused Taft to lose progressive support, saying, hey, you promised to be a tariff lowerer, and yes, you might reform it, but the result was the tariffs went up. Subpoint C. Conservationists also got angry with Taft. Taft, I don't want to make him sound like he was the bad guy on this, but he definitely mismanaged a conservation problem. When his Secretary of the Interior, Richard Bollinger, put reserved land, so Secretary of Interior, Department of Interior manages things that are outside. It's perfectly Washington, D.C., but national parks and stuff like that. And so he takes these public land, or these lands that were designed to be preservation lands, and then submits them to the public domain, that it could be free to any use. When the Department of Interior officials protested that action, saying, no, this is conservation land, not public use land, Bollinger says, you don't criticize policy publicly in front of everybody, and fired that official. And then he immediately wrote a muckraking expose in Collier's Weekly against Bollinger, calling him out on this, hey, I'm trying to preserve the goals and you fire me when I challenge you. Congress immediately opened up an investigation of the Department of Interior, and they called a guy named Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot was the head of the U.S. Forest Service, who then testified against Bollinger. Taft got mad about this and said, wait a minute, you're both in my administration, and why are you testifying against another person on our team? And so, basically you're challenging the authority of your superior, and that's dissension in the ranks. And so Taft fired Pinchot. Well, when he did that, it makes Taft look like he's trying to go hide evidence and get around to testifying. And I think this part was mismanaged on all parts, on all sides. Subpoint D. Taft does take a progressive approach to taxes, except for a very brief time during the Civil War. The Civil War had a short-lived attempt to go tax corporate earnings. Civil War had a national income tax. Then when the war was over, they canceled the national income tax. And then there was an attempt in the 1890s to go tax corporate earnings, and it didn't really work out very well. But in general, the United States did not have an income tax. And the federal government collected its tax revenue through tariffs. Tariffs are those, taxes on imported goods. So when taxes are made in another country and brought to the United States, the ships are required to go pay certain taxes for the right to unload their materials in U.S. ports. Sellers then raised money to go pay that tax by raising the price of the goods. In effect, it made imported goods more expensive than similar goods produced inside the United States. But because it makes imports more expensive, some people argue that tariffs actually help American businesses and they protect American jobs, because stuff made in America is not subject to the tariff, so it looks like it's a lower price than the stuff that's imported. And it makes American goods look cheaper than imports. Others argue, though, that because it allows domestic producers to not compete fairly against foreign producers, it allows domestic producers to raise their prices higher than what the market value would be. That allows, because the domestic competition and the foreign competition aren't really competing against each other. Those people argue that tariffs actually raise the cost of goods to consumers. And although it helps protect American jobs, it makes everybody pay more for goods. It pays more good for stuff, regardless of whether or not they made it at home or abroad. Progressives also argued that tariffs were discriminating against the poor and the working classes. Though all consumers, poor or rich, would pay higher prices for the stuff they purchased, poor people couldn't as easily afford those high rates. And so they ended up, while it may seem like the tariff causes other countries to go pay more for their stuff, the actual effect is the federal government hurts the poorest Americans, progressives argued. Instead, they said, let's have a federal income tax where people would pay different percentages of their income based on how much they earned in a given year. This graduated tax, that's what it's called, a graduated tax, progressives argued, was a fairer way to raise government revenue. And so we see the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution that created that federal income tax. It was proposed in 1909 during Taft's presidency, and it was established after Taft leaves office during the Wilson presidency. It was the third slowest amendment to the Constitution at 1,302 days, almost 3.5 years between its proposal and its amendment, and between its proposal and its ratification. We can't really give Taft or Wilson the credit for it. Amendments just don't work like that, but they're both involved in a progressive policy. Roman numeral number 17. Republicans were split over Taft's support of the Speaker of the House, a guy named Joseph Cannon, sometimes referred to as Uncle Joe. Joe Cannon was a rough-talking, good old boy who often disregarded some of the rules of behavior in the House of Representatives, specifically his seniority rules. He also weakened the progressive agenda. While he and Taft were both in the Republican Party, they were not both progressives and had opposite approaches towards social issues and societal and government issues. And so he was often weakening the progressive agenda, even within members of his own party. And sometimes he just outright ignored progressive-minded bills, and so they never saw the floor. There's a lot of power in the Speaker of the House's responsibilities. So in March of 1910, Republican progressives, so they're progressives, but they're in the same party as Joe Cannon, and they teamed up with Democrats to go marginalize Joe Cannon. But by the midterm elections that year, the Republican Party was so fractured that Democrats took control of the House, and Joe Cannon was no longer the Speaker of the House because he had lost the majority party. Subpoint B. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt had returned from a hunting trip to Africa. So after stepping down from the presidency, he just traveled the world and went on safari and shot big game. And he found the Republican Party back home that was hungry for Roosevelt's style of power and leadership, or at least that's how Roosevelt interpreted it. And so he goes to the party convention and expected to go have him named as the nominee instead of Taft, whom he kind of thought was mismanaging the presidency. So he goes to the party, and there at the convention, he finds out that Taft had actually been a pretty good Republican machinist, and had figured out that Taft supporters were there at the convention, and they outmaneuvered Roosevelt's coalition for the nomination for the presidency. So Taft returns back. He expects to get nominated by the Republican Party for president. It turns out he doesn't get the nomination because the guy he picked as his earlier successor does get the nomination. But undaunted, and this is so classic Teddy Roosevelt, undaunted, he decided that if he still had a good enough electoral chance just in the public, that he should go win office as a third-party candidate. And so he doesn't run as a Republican. He certainly doesn't go to the Democratic Party, and he starts a new party, the Progressive Party, which also becomes known as the Bull Moose Party. A bull moose, a strong animal that just can't be stopped, and that's kind of how Roosevelt envisioned this progressive movement. And they promised more voter participation in the government. Teddy Roosevelt turns around and supports women's suffrage. He actually becomes the first significant presidential candidate to say that women should have the right to vote. He also supported labor legislation to go protect workers in unions and stronger business controls. And so in 1912, he sets up for the election, and the election ended up being really a four-way race between the Republican incumbent, Taft, the bull moose progressive former Republican, Teddy Roosevelt, the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson was a reform-minded governor. He's a Democrat, the former governor of New Jersey, and then Eugene V. Debs of the Socialist Party. And these four visions go compete for the presidency in 1912. Wilson endorsed a progressive platform. He called it the New Freedom, and it was really like the Wilsonian approach to progressive ideas. It called for stronger antitrust laws, real banking reform, and then lower tariffs. Wilson says that all monopolies are basically evil, and that anytime there's a monopoly, you need to crush it and break it up. Roosevelt also wanted oversight over big business. I mean, he's the trust buster, right? But he insisted that not all monopolies are bad, and sometimes they could because work in the public interest and keep prices low, because the competition sometimes is an inefficient way to go compete in the, like offer services. Debs is a socialist, kind of a classic socialist. He wanted to just end capitalism altogether, and the idea of monopolies or trust busting, like all of that needed to go away, and of the power of the industries and economics be put in the hands of the people, not in corporations. While socialism was influential in the debate, Debs was not significant in the voting. There just weren't enough actual socialists to go show up in the electoral calculus. The Republican Party ended up being divided. You had the progressives who weren't really sure which candidate to go vote for. You had the non-progressive Republicans, which are, find that they could maybe hold their nose and vote for Taft. But basically, the Republican Party was split. The Socialist Party was irrelevant, and Woodrow Wilson won a pretty easy electoral victory. And when he did so, he also brought into Congress a Democratic majority with him. This sets up kind of, I don't want to say the end of the Progressive Party, the end of the progressive movement, because progressive ideas will continue through the Wilson presidency, but it will end our unit, because we're going to pick up the story of the Wilson presidency as we put it in the context of some other issues in American history. Those issues are super exciting, and I can't wait to tell you about them. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.